we want to talk about pine trees. So the pine tree has a lot of gifts that it can offer us. One thing about a pine tree is they tend to grow, at least here in North Carolina, it's a pioneer species. So when things get disturbed, the pine trees will pop up and they'll eventually get overshadowed, outcompeted by deciduous trees, hardwoods. So the pine, when you see pines, especially a whole bunch of them, it usually means that there's some kind of disturbance, maybe an old farm field or something. But one of the first things I know about pines is the pine needles. And by the way, you can tell a pine needle by looking at these needles. That distinguishes it, at least in this area, from like cedars that kind of have scales. They don't have these long needles. So when you see like a little bundle, this has 3, which tells me by the length of it that there's 3, that this is a loblolly pine. But even if you can't tell the species of pine, if you can tell it's a pine tree, you can chop up these needles, boil them in a pot, put a lid on, let it cool off, and you've got really strong vitamin C rich tea that tastes sort of like Theraflu, and it's one of the best things I know of for knocking out a cold. So especially now with all this concern about viruses and stuff, if I start feeling like I'm getting sick, this is one of my main go-to things. I'm just going to start drinking pine needle tea like there's no tomorrow. Just keep it boiling, keep drinking it, because the hydration itself is good for you. The hot water helps you flush things out, and then the vitamin C, hugely good. And I believe the living energy of just a plant, using any plant, is good for you, much less a pine tree that has that specific gift. Also, this time of year, the pines are putting out a lot of pollen, so you can actually make a flower. Like take a jar and shake these things. I don't know if you can see like the little bit of pollen coming out, but you can go around and collect it at the right time of year. Actually fill up a jar with pine pollen, and if you mix it 50-50, I haven't done this, I just heard about this, with regular flour, you can make bread, enriched bread with this pine pollen. In a survival situation, you can take the outer bark off, like Yul Gibbons in that old commercial, "Did you know you can eat a pine tree?" You can take the outer bark off and eat the inner bark. It tastes terrible. It's like a 2x4 mixed with a green banana. But it's got starches in it, so if you were really desperate for food, that is a source of food. And of course, later in the year, there's the pine cones. And I haven't experimented with this much either, but I've heard you can take those pine cones, if you practice, you know, figure out when the right stage is. Often when they're starting to open, I think. Although, like I said, I don't have much experience with pine cones. But you can set some of them by a fire and it'll open them up and you can eat the pine nuts inside. Yeah, and pine roots are also a source of, if you can dig up a pine root, you can use that for cordage. I've seen it in a survival situation, using it for a bow drill fire. They're kind of reddish and bendy. And again, it's practice getting it at the right stage before they get old and brittle. And I think I've heard people pounding them up and drying them out, and you can use that for flour too. So, is there anything I'm forgetting, Teresa, about the pine tree?
I just wanted to say about the pine needle tea that you made that for me one time when I wasn't feeling well, and I think it helped. I think it helped me kick whatever was going on in my body that was bad, kick it out.
Yeah, and that was in somewhere out west. That might have been a hemlock tree.
That was in the Great Basin of Nevada. It's like a park.
And a lot of the evergreen trees share similar cut characteristics. So don't be intimidated if you don't know which kind of pine. If you can tell the difference. Oh, let's move right over here. Here's the difference. See, when you see them side by side, this is a cedar. Much different than that needle I just showed you. So if you can tell it's a pine tree, they come in different clusters, maybe 5 to 2, depending on the species. Different lengths. Some of them can be that long. Some of them are like twice as long as my palm. But if it's a pine tree, everything I said holds true. And if you forget everything else, pine needle tea. That is huge. All those sailors that were along the North American coast that were getting scurvy, they were passing pine trees everywhere, and they just didn't know that that was a source of vitamin C. They could have avoided all that scurvy. So thank you, pine tree. I guarantee you're near some kind of pine. It is a super successful species that is abundant in a lot of places. Because we disturb so much stuff, pine trees are kind of, it's the heyday for pine.
I'll end with a shot of this field over here that has been reclaimed by the pines.
Yeah, great example. There's all the pines coming up, and if we leave it alone for hundreds of years, the oaks and hickories will overshadow them, and the pines will thin out and grow in another disturbed place.